The MS-06F Zaku 2 F-Type was Zeon's main mobile suit for the majority of the one-year war, but despite its initial superiority and even the production of a dedicated commander unit, the S-Type, the changing needs of the battlefield and requests from ace pilots for more performance would result in Zeon engineers beginning their pursuit for a high mobility version, aptly named the Zaku 2 High Mobility Type. And if you need a highly mobile VPN to protect both your online data and dodge those pesky region locks, then look no further than today's sponsor NordVPN. Their combination of user-friendliness, top-notch security, and top speeds have made them the top VPN and a part of my daily arsenal. And by using the code kkrt or the link down below, you'll not just get a sweet discount, but you'll also be supporting the channel. The history of the high mobility type then can actually be traced back to before the one-year war even began. When Major Elliot Rem, one of Zeon's top engineers and test pilots, saw the performance of the standard Zaku 2, he proposed to make a high-performance version. But with the war quickly approaching, Zeon's high command would only allow for a stripped-down version of his idea. Rather than using all cutting-edge parts, serviceability with the standard Zaku needed to be maintained, something that was necessary from both a manufacturing and a maintenance point of view. So instead of the high mobility type that Elliot had envisioned, he instead had to settle for the Zaku 2 S-Type, now also commonly referred to as the Commander type. However, after the Antarctic Treaty had been concluded, it quickly became obvious to everyone that this war was going to be a long drawn-out one, long enough for the Federation to come up with their own mobile suits. And so Major Elliot Rem was given the green light to finally create the Zaku that he wanted to create. The development of the high mobility type began with the production of 2 prototype units at Granada. These units had main thrusters that were almost twice as big as those of the F-Type and provided significantly more thrust at 218 tons each. The backpack itself was completely different to house and cool these improved thrusters, and the internal fuel tank was enlarged to keep up the operating time. The legs then were also overhauled and outfitted with 3 sub-thrusters, providing 45 tons of thrust each. And the final change then was the antenna that was now on the back of the head rather than the front of the head, where the communication antennas were typically placed on the Zakus. After they were rolled out then, they were extensively tested for 2 weeks, with Unit 1 being assigned to Elliot. And the results of these tests were so good that the Zaku 2 high mobility type was immediately approved for mass production, with an initial order of 22 units. Also, during these 2 weeks of testing, it was decided to test out 2 new types of bazooka, a 420mm one and a 360mm one. The 420mm version would eventually be axed due to production issues, but the 360mm version would be just as successful as the Zaku itself, and would be approved for mass production after some slight upgrades. Not only would this giant bazooka become the standard weapon for the high mobility type, but also for the Dom and the Rig Dom. One interesting thing then that I read in the MSV Ace Pilot logbook is that apparently the giant bazooka requires a liquid explosive to be fed through the mobile suit's manipulators, meaning that it could only be used by mobile suits that had this particular system, like the Zaku 2 high mobility types and the Dom family. Back to the prototype Zaku 2 high mobility types then. It was also rumored that during testing, Unit 2 was at some point piloted by the famous ace pilot Shin Matsunaga, and unfortunately crash-landed near Air City after engine trouble. And that Unit 1 was outfitted with prototype parts that would later be used for the Recon Zakus. These new parts were then tested out in a mock battle against the Black Tri-Stars, but this fight was unfortunately interrupted by the Federation, and the unit was returned to its original specifications. However, these would only be the beginning of the Zaku high mobility types' troubles. The initial production type was designated as the MS-06R1 and featured quite some differences with the prototype version. The internals were overhauled to increase ease of production, small thrusters were added, and the internal fuel tank in the waist was now replaced by multiple fuel tanks in the torso and the legs, giving it greater fuel capacity. So, despite looking mostly the same on the outside, the R1 was actually quite the different unit on the inside when compared to the prototype version and the F-Type. As for those minor outward differences then, the legs were slightly different, the right shoulder had 2 intake vents, the shoulder shield got 2 reinforcement bars at the bend, the spike shield got a reinforced edge, the front skirt got 4 spike-like reinforcements, the elbows got extra armor, and the antenna on the back of the head was now either removed for standard versions or moved to its normal location for commander versions. So, on paper, the R1 was a formidable fighting machine with significantly higher performance than the F-Type and even the S-Type. So it wouldn't be long before the unit saw actual combat. But in practice, the unit suffered from frequent engine problems, they quickly ran out of fuel, and for many pilots, the aggressive increase in thrust over the F-Type wasn't seen as a positive, but rather as a negative, because this made the machine significantly harder to control. I even found a source that claims that because of these problems, Zeonic was forced to temporarily halt the production. But whatever the case might be, the pilot feedback from these initial R1s was significantly worse than the universal praise that the high mobility type received during its testing. Part of this was due to some genuine issues that needed fixing, and part of this was due to Zeon's lack of skilled pilots, with many of Zeon's experienced pilots having died during the 1-week war and the Battle of Loon. This was evident by the fact that the R1 was actually highly rated by a handful of ace pilots like Brenneth Ox, Norith Bauer, or Shin Matsunaga, who even earned his nickname the White Wolf of Solomon in one of these machines. And all of this prompted Zeonic to make an improved version, dubbed the R1A. One of the main changes made was changing the standard fuel tanks to fuel cartridges that could be exchanged much faster. And this wasn't just possible on board of a ship, but also on the battlefield. This led to a lot of squadrons that were using the new R1As to also start using Zakus to carry extra fuel cartridges into combat so that they could refuel their commander on the fly. And the moose size used by these squadrons were also modified to make exchanging the cartridges even faster. And to house these fuel cartridges, the backs of the R1A's legs were also changed, something that would be the main identifier to distinguish the R1A from the regular R1. Because even though the standard R1A seems to have ditched all of the R1's armor improvements, potentially to either save on weight to increase mobility or decrease fuel usage, there were still quite some R1As with some, or even all of the R1's armor, with the 2 most obvious ones being Shin Matsunaga's unit and Masaya Nakagawa's unit. And for this, we have 2 main theories. The first one is that in total 66 R1A units existed. 56 of these were brand new units, and 10 of these were upgraded R1s. So it's possible that these were R1s that had been upgraded internally, but not externally. Another possible explanation is that apparently the production of the R1As wasn't 100% unified, with different factories putting out units of different quality. So maybe one of these factories still had some R1 parts lying around and decided to use those, or maybe the pilots simply chose to have those parts because they wanted them. This then brings us to our next point. the production issues. While the production was streamlined to some point, allowing the R1A to be produced at more places than the R1, it was still an extremely expensive unit. As mentioned before, there were only 66 R1As around, and then 12 remaining R1s, which led to a joke amongst Zeon pilots that it was actually more difficult to get a high mobility type than it was to shoot down a Magellan-class ship. And this difficulty to get your hands on a high mobility type wasn't just due to its rareness. Having learned from the initial deployment of the R1, Zeonic pushed the Zeon High Command to only issue the R1A to top ace pilots who could make the most out of this beastly mobile suit. And before long, the Zaku 2 high mobility type R1A would achieve legendary status thanks to its combination of top Zeon technology and the best pilots that Zeon still had to offer. Names like the Black Tri-Stars, Shin Matsunaga, Eric Mansfield, Uma Lightning, Anna Volgato, and Masaya Nakagawa. Many of them would also paint their Zaku in their own custom colors, with some of them also having unique commander antennas or other personal touches. Another advancement of the R1A then was its new ejection system. Not only could the seed be ejected, but it also had limited propulsion and was outfitted with solar energy cells with a life support system. And to use this life support system, pilots had to wear a dedicated normal suit and helmet, the M79F Mark III and M78D Mark VI respectively. As the war went on then, it became more and more evident that a general purpose replacement was needed for the MS-06F, a situation that led to a second arms race between Zeonic and Zimad. And Zeonic believed that a development of their R1A would be perfect to get the contract for Zeon's next generation mass production mobile suit. That, or it was the only option left after their upcoming Gelgoog was hitting delay after delay and wouldn't be finished anywhere near the deadline. We don't know many of the requirements for the contract, but we do know one of the most important ones. The mobile suit needed to be able to use beam weapons. And in response to this problem, the Zeonic engineers got to work installing the generator meant for the Gelgoog, which at that point was still known as the MS-11, inside of a Zaku. To make it fit, the chest was made larger, and the backpack now had to be connected to the body with extra supports. To ensure enough cooling for the generator in this confined space then, 2 extra cooling vents were added to the sides of the chest. Additionally, the backpack was made bigger, and extra armor was added to the legs. But despite all of this though, not enough power could be generated to fire strong enough beams. And even after multiple attempts, the development got bogged down without being able to meet the requirements for the plan. But fortunately for Zeonic, Zimad was having similar problems with their entry, the MS-09R Rigdom. This then forced the Zeon brass to drop the beam requirements from the contract, but at the same time, the entire plan was now changed from being their next generation mass production mobile suit to simply being an interim production mobile suit until a mobile suit could be developed that met the original plan's requirements. And thanks to this, the MS-06 R2P Zaku 2 high mobility type test type would now be converted into the MS-06 R2 Zaku 2 high mobility type that we all know and love today. With the beam weapon requirement no longer in place, the generator was replaced with a simplified version that was more stable and smaller, which then made it possible to revert the Zaku back to its standard chest size. And this of course also reduced the weight of the overall machine. Another weight saving measure then was that despite using extra armor on the legs, thanks to the materials used, they were lighter without sacrificing protection. Other changes then include fuel tanks in the backpack that are 18% bigger and stronger thrusters, 316 tons for each of the 2 main thrusters, and then per leg, 1 sub-thruster with 58 tons of thrust, and 2 with 45 tons of thrust. And the internals, they were completely overhauled. Many experimental parts for the Gelgoog were also used inside of the R2, resulting in a machine that looked like a Zaku, but was in a completely different class. It was sometimes even called a Gelgoog in Zaku's clothes. And with Elliot Rem as the test pilot, the R2 could really show off its capabilities. But it wasn't meant to be. Despite being an excellent machine, Zermatt's Rigdom was better suited to the Zeon High Command's demands. While the R2 was faster and more agile, the Dom had the edge in raw power, the amount of weapons it could carry, and perhaps most important of all, ease of production. Remember, the R2 was essentially a souped-up version of the already expensive R1A with even more prototype parts. And another thing that the Dom had without a doubt in its favor was ease of piloting. The R1A was notoriously difficult to pilot, so it stands to reason that the R2, with its even more aggressive thrust, was at least equally difficult, if not more difficult to pilot. So all of this made the Dom the obvious choice for mass production, and the R2 would only receive 3 more units for a total of 4. And apparently, when these 3 new units were built, they had the same generator as the R1A, but 2 weeks after, they would be upgraded to the same reactor as Unit 1. Another fun fact is that all 4 units received a commander antenna just because the designer felt like it, and not because they would be assigned to commanders. But in practice, they would all end up in the hands of high-ranking ace pilots. And together with their extremely rare machines, they would achieve legendary status. There's the brown and black R2 belonging to Lieutenant Colonel Gabby Hazard, the blue and yellow R2 belonging to Colonel Robert Gilliam, and then the crimson, red, and black R2 belonging to Major Johnny Ryden, better known as the Crimson Lightning. And it would also be his R2 that was most prominently featured in propaganda footage, leading to his Zaku becoming the de facto image of the R2. And finally, there was the unit converted from the R2P. This unit stayed with Elliot Rem and would be used for further testing and developments, something that would eventually lead to the MS-06 R3S High Mobility Type Zaku, a machine that was sometimes also referred to as the prototype Gelgoog. So we'll be having a closer look at that thing when we tackle the Gelgoog's development history. For now then, let's look at some other happenings with the R2, because despite this being the full official story, over the years there have been quite some claims, like Johnny Ryden's unit being further upgraded into something that he himself called the Full Bullet Zaku. Faced with the Federation's powerful Luna titanium alloy, this heavily armed Zaku served as the Plan B in case that the beam weapon capable Gelgoog couldn't make it. The idea was that even though 1 bullet might not damage a Gundam, 100 would surely make some kind of an impact. So they tried strapping as much freedom to this mobile suit as possible. It had a double Vulcan gun on the chest, 2 high-speed Crusher cannon machine guns on the right shoulder armor, an enhanced version of the Desert Zaku's 3-tube missile launcher on the right arm, a triple machine gun on the left arm, a big gun on both hips, yes, that is the official name for that thing, and as finishing touch, the commander antenna was now a heat hog, because why not? And supposedly, Johnny Ryden would use his machine after his Gelgoog high mobility type was damaged, and would manage to take out the full armored Gundam that it was designed to defeat. which, by the way, is another mobile suit with a questionable existence. And the next unconfirmed machine was the MS-06R2S Zaku late production type Dozle Zombie Custom. This machine was supposedly being developed at Solomon to be Dozle Zombie's personal unit and would be a powerful anti-ship unit. It had a machine gun and a large heat hawk, but its most powerful weapons were a pair of megaparticle cannons installed in its abdomen. However, because the reactor wasn't powerful enough to run these by itself, the unit was designed to connect to another mobile suit to get enough juice. And for this, a dedicated machine called the Energy Backup Escort Unit was developed, but it's not known if any were actually built. Unfortunately for Dozle though, the Federation attacked Solomon when the Zaku was still under construction, and he was forced to sortie in the Big Zam instead. And during the attack, the machine was lost, with only its data making it out on board of a Guazine. We can only imagine how the war would have ended for Zeon had they been able to mass produce the Zaku late production type. A minor variant then was supposedly piloted by Lieutenant Kurt Roswell in the Spirits of Zeon arcade game. It had a custom left shoulder shield and slightly different leg armor, but the main problem is of course that this goes against the established canon of there only being 4 R2s. It's cool for a game, but by no means official. And before we wrap up, I want to go back to the Zaku High Mobility Type R1A to talk about 2 obscure variants that I found. But just like those R2 variants that we just went over, they are of questionable officialness and canonicity. The first one is the MS-06R1D, a unit that appeared in the July 1987 issue of Hobby Japan and was basically just the R1A, but with more powerful thrusters on both the backpack and the legs. Something that made it even harder to pilot than the already difficult to pilot R1 and R1A. As its main weapon, it used an improved version of the giant bazooka, and this jet black Zaku was used by Degner Romeo as part of the 13th Independent Company Dragoon 13, as part of the defense of Abawaku. The second unit then was the MS-06R1M. This unit appeared as part of a game in the Game Gather magazine and was the Marine Corps version of the High Mobility type. Apparently, it appeared as a custom Gunpla in the magazine and was essentially a Zaku 2 FZ with the legs and the backpack of the R1A. And this unit was painted in black Tristar's colors. And to really wrap things up then, I want to talk about the timeline of events for the mainline Zaku 2 High Mobility type, because as you may or may not know, the timeline varies quite a bit with that of the High Mobility type from the origin. In the mainline, there were no High Mobility types present at the Battle of Loom, and in fact, the earliest mention I could find was of an R1 being used by Brenneth Oggs several months after the Battle of Loom. For the R1A then, we know that Gabby Hazard received his unit, which at the time was brand new, in June, meaning that that thing was probably either rolled out in June or in May. And for the R2, according to the MSV Ace pilot log, the decision to adopt the Dom as a stopgap mobile suit was taken on July 31st. And a few days later, Johnny Ryden would be promoted to Major and receive his R2, meaning that the R2 was most likely rolled out in July. And that has been all for this very lengthy Zaku 2 High Mobility type development history. I was originally planning on combining this with the Zaku Recon types because there is a little bit of overlap, but it quickly became obvious that just the High Mobility types had a ton of lore behind them, and way more than I thought there was going to be. And because we do know quite a bit about the individual units, I could have made this video even longer. Also, In case you're wondering where the Zaku high mobility test type from the 08th MS team is, well, despite its name, it's got nothing to do with the other high mobility types. It was made to test out the rig Dom's legs, so we'll go over that in the Dom's development history. So, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more similar videos in the future. If you want a sweet VPN, you can get NordVPN with the link down below. And as always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great day, and I'll see you all next time.